Hello and welcome to the pod. I'm Nathan Fink.
I'm Joelyn Drennan, and this is New Hampshire Family Now,
a show about building family in the Granite State. Today in the podcast, Joelyn helps me level set while traveling with children, and later incoming president and CEO of New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, Anthony Poore, joins us to talk opportunities no matter who you love, how big your pocketbook is, or where you lay your head in the state. New Hampshire Family Now is brought to you by the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Since 1962, the Charitable Foundation has worked hand in hand with generous and visionary citizens to maximize the power of giving and support, collaborate, and lead innovative initiatives. Initiatives like New Hampshire Tomorrow, which is focused on making sure children and families have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure every family member thrives. To learn more about New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and all their initiatives, go to www.nhcf.org. This podcast was also brought to you by Family Support New Hampshire. Family Support New Hampshire is NH's coalition of family resource centers and family strengthening programs that exist to ensure Granite State families have access to resources so both caregivers and children can succeed. Because supported families are strong families. To find a family resource center near you, visit www.fsnh.org. Hey, it's Nathan, co-host of New Hampshire Family Now. I wanted to take a quick break from the show because it occurred to me the other day that I've never asked you to subscribe to this podcast. Subscribing is free, and when you do it, it helps our placement algorithms, making it that much easier for caregivers across New Hampshire to find valuable information and strategies for their families. Also, you'll be alerted when a new episode drops. And if you like the show, leaving a review helps us that much more. So go to wherever you get your podcast, type in New Hampshire Family Now, and as the kids say, smash that subscribe button. I say click it, because if you smash it, then you're going to need a new one. Thank you and enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome to the show, and many apologies for the delayed release. As Joelyn, you know, I was traveling to Wisconsin with family for the annual pickling of my digestive tract.
I do know that. How'd that go?
I don't know if you experienced this with Tom in Mississippi, but my wife and I, every time we make this trek in the summer times, there's a lot of anxiety for us. I think it's because we're constantly putting our kids in these difficult situations. You know, like we drive for, 20 hours. We get bad sleep. We get sugary drinks, food. And then we're totally expecting them to perform for our relatives in a way. And when we're expecting them to perform, it's like, show me your best behavior, manners, no arguing, right to bed. And we only see extended family once, maybe twice a year, but it never feels like they get to see my kids at their best, or even me as a parent, because there I am flailing, being like, why won't they do this? You know what I mean? And then catch myself being sarcastic, and then like, that's not the parent I am either. So.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that happens. I think that happens to all parents, is that you have this like kind of ideal or narrative of like how your children are going to act and then how you're going to present as a parent. And then it kind of, they're like climbing the walls and tired and hungry and, maybe breaking things. I don't know. My son kind of a little roughhouser. So, and then it's like, oh, the judgment, you're worried about the judgment. You're like the anxiety about it. Like, oh, do they think I'm a good parent?
Right. You're from Nashua?
Yeah.
I bet, is there kind of an added layer when you go to Mississippi that you're like...
I think where I get the anxiety is that we have like different ideas about like, just like food is one thing. Like our house, there's not soda and candy and that kind of stuff all over the house. That's like a treat. But down there, that's, it's readily available. And, my mother-in-law is like a fantastic cook. She makes desserts and everything like that. And so I don't want to like stop my son from enjoying that stuff. But I do find myself going like, oh, that's like, you've had like 5 pieces of pie today and like a Dr. Pepper, which, he just doesn't have at home. So it's like that kind of stuff that
it's when your child thinks of popsicles as juice.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, can I have some of that solid juice you always give me when I'm a problem and you need me to settle down?
Yeah.
I guess the question is, what do I do about it? But wait, actually, before you answer that, because apparently I'm really good at this, let's break into 2 categories, because I think I'm hearing or I'm feeling that really, how do I deal with my anxiety is one side of it. And then the other side is, all right, how do I help my children so they can be themselves? Because they're really good kids. It's just kind of, imposed barriers that sometimes I'm thrown up or the situation is thrown up.
I think you remind yourself of exactly that they're in a different situation. They're young. They haven't, mastered self-regulation yet, and their schedules are off there, and reducing the barriers for them and just being like, you know what, is that your fifth piece of pie today? Like, you know what, it's not going to kill anyone. Now every day, then yes, it will kill someone, but just like relaxing into the idea that you're on vacation, and then also kind of examining like, what is the narrative that you've told yourself?
Like they should, like, what's the expectation? Is that what you're saying?
Like if you're setting unrealistic expectations, why? And does it come back to you? Like, do you expect them to act in a certain way at home, but is it different than the way you expect them to act at your...
Definitely. We've had this conversation, I think, in the past where we're talking about intersecting with different contexts for them, which I think is a good thing. But when it's anxiety inducing, then it creates what I'm thinking of as almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that people, and in this case, children, can only act within like the barriers or boundaries or even the opportunities you give them. So like if I'm uptight, if I'm giving them more restrictions and unrealistic expectations or higher expectations, they're going to push back on those parameters, as they should.
Yeah, I think that even if you think about even like social skills or being able to read social settings, you often might find yourself like trying to hold your child to the standard of an adult. Like I can drive for 20 hours and eat garbage and still hold a conversation and, be presentable because you have executive function to do that. And right. A kid, that is, you're putting an adult expectation onto a kid. So I think just being aware of those things and really just being aware of child development, and that helps with the expectations too.
Now, how do you in your travels then manage the other side? Like, are there any things that you do that helps Wiley? Given all of that kind of noise of the travel, what things do you kind of build into your schedule so that you can allow them to be in control?
So I think something that I do, and this is whether I'm traveling or not, but if I do have an expectation, is to talk about it beforehand, like before you enter into, so like just even say you're going into a store and you can anticipate like, well, he's going to ask me because he wants this toy or he wants to ride in the cart or he's going to be all over the place. And you kind of like set the expectation before and talk with him about it. So I'll be like, all right, we're going to go into the store. This needs to be a quick trip. We're not stopping over here. And then I make him repeat it back to me, like this is what we're not doing. So it's in his head. So then if you do have to remind him when you're in the store one time, it's like less of a power struggle, you know? So I think just being intentional about just kind of preparing. And then what's available there? Like, can they go run out in a field? If there's, like if they're like super high energy, can you stop and go take a walk, or giving them those kind of like outlets?
I suppose in many ways, for me, this is about trust, trusting them that they know themselves, that they're with their actions communicating an authentic experience, and that experience in this circumstance is shaped by things outside their control. Now, the other flip side is the anxiety. And that's me. And reminding the self is one tool. But, even though you're like, I'm not going to be anxious about this, you're still anxious. And for me, this trip, I woke up and I went running almost every day.
That's great. That's like, I think you took a little bit of space. You blew off some steam. You did and you exerted some energy. So that's a release. Also, I think knowing that your family is really happy to see you and they're going to take you in whatever form you are. Right. And that it should, kind of trumps whatever expectations you're putting on. And just to remind myself that, because I look and I'm like, oh.
But that's interesting, because I just realized that my parents are on my team and that their number one concern is how am I doing? That actually nets down my anxiety, because kids are kids, and whether or not their kids are now, I'm 42, grown and out and less rambunctious, I think is fine. Just reminding yourself that, look, this is what kids do. This is who they are. And this is part of their experience.
Yeah. And then I think too is like, I guess just to think, put yourself in your kids' shoes. It's like how, if when you were a little kid and you were on a trip and if you were being held to a certain standard or you're like acting a little wild, and like, how did you feel when your parents were, telling you like straighten up and go sit down and do that, and you couldn't? And how did it make you feel? Because that's how your kid is, interpreting the situation. So you don't want to set them up to fail.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. You're the best. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thanks for having me.
And when we come back, Anthony Poore joins us. Don't go anywhere. Many thanks to New Hampshire's Office of Social and Emotional Wellness for sponsoring this podcast. Started within New Hampshire's Department of Education, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness consolidates policy development and implements projects and programs that are focused on health and wellness with an emphasis on behavioral health of all students, youth, and families. To learn more about the Department of Education and its many programs and approaches, visit www.education.nh.gov. Today's show was also brought to you by Merrimack County Savings Bank, who proudly supports the mission and efforts of New Hampshire Children's Trust. Founded in 1867, Merrimack has served people, businesses, nonprofits, and municipalities in central and southern New Hampshire for over 155 years by treating everyone with care, respect, and compassion. Visit your local offices in Bow, Concord, Kentucky, Hooksett, and Nashua, or go to www.themerrimack.com. This podcast was brought to you by Nixon Peabody, who delivers exceptional legal services for clients in the community by combining high performance, an entrepreneurial spirit, deep engagement, and an unwavering commitment to a culture of collaboration, diversity, and humanity. Nixon Peabody works with universities, hospitals, and nonprofits of every size to maximize impact. For more information, visit nixonpeabody.com. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Anthony Poore, incoming president and CEO of New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, a new organization focusing on closing gaps and establishing policies and programs for populations that are often excluded. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate it very much.
Before we started recording, I had asked you whether or not I can call you founder, and there was immediate pushback, I think, or reframing of that. So what is it about, say, coming in and looking at this organization and the idea of founder that doesn't sit well with you?
Well, not that it doesn't sit necessarily well. It's just that I think it's an idealized portrait of me, the individual who's lucky enough to come into this position, if you will. And so the reason I push back a little bit is when I think about a founder of an organization, it's as if the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity was somehow my idea, my original idea, when in fact, that's far from the case. You know, the work of the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity started well before I was tasked to lift up this institution. And so it really stands on the shoulders of the work of the endowment and its Race and Equity in New Hampshire series work. And so that's why you saw me a little hesitant to say founder. I'll accept president and CEO. But the real credit goes to those who came before me.
Now, this might be a messy question right on the box, given that kind of framing. But when I had met you at the endowment's annual event, we were talking about this new organization. And to my mind, organizations tend to arise out of, say, specific contexts or happenings in a community or the world at large. Now, with regards to New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, what is the context here? And what does your organization aim to do about that context?
Maybe a little long-winded here, so please forgive me. There's a lot in your question. So in terms of context, I think this is important. I think when we think about New Hampshire, I think the reality is we're still largely a rural state. When you think about that contextually, you know, racial diversity increased in non-metropolitan America over the past decade. It's undeniable. In fact, diversity in rural America increased where our shared numbers decreased. And you look at the rural child population, it's much larger than the adult population. So when we think about New Hampshire within the context of the American states, you know, we're seeing that already. In fact, that growing diversity represents both challenges and opportunities for both our rural and our metropolitan community. Now, let's just step back. When we think about New Hampshire and specifically, while New Hampshire is far less diverse than other parts of the country, you know, you look, our numbers doubled over the past census report from 2010 to 2020. We're now about 13% of the state's population. And when you're looking at two metropolitan communities, both Manchester and Nashua, there are 50% of that community resides in those two major metropolitan areas. In fact, my daughter, who's a recent graduate from Manchester Central High School, Go Little Green, attends a minority-majority high school. And so this is real, you know, separate in part just from our communities of color, our women, our LGBTQ plus community, and New Hampshire's disability communities also suffer disproportionately than the majority, if you will. And so it's not just, you know, the New Hampshire Center is not just focused on, for example, our communities of color. It's really focused on all those similarly marginalized communities who, in fact, don't fare well on many of the report cards as you think about the social determinants of health. That's kind of the context. Now, when we think about the center, again, I want to be a little long-winded here, but, you know, the center is really intended to act as a convener across various stakeholder groups and geographies. So for north of the Notch, south of the Notch, seacoast of the Upper Valley, there's a program or a policy that will be affected by the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity. We're going to focus on building these relationships to make strides to correct these inequities. And we want to encourage partnerships and collaboration, again, across sector and geographies, because we know that this is the only way that we can manifest a kind of systems change, not programs and projects, but systems change necessary to ensure that our communities can not only sustain themselves, but prosper and thrive.
Now, it's interesting you say systems, because systems are potentially the expression of cultural framing in some way. And I want to use myself as the example here. And maybe it's because of the cultural context I find myself in with regards to, say, January 6th hearings are on, and this kind of push-pull thing that's happening in mental framing. How should I, as an individual, think of this as an opportunity for all of us to belong and all to experience positive outcomes that it affords?
Thank you for the easy question, no less. Wow. So a couple of things here. I think, yes, it is true that disparities exist across all measures from childhood to the grave, particularly when we think about New Hampshire's community of colors and these other similarly marginalized communities that we talked about before. So that's a fact. I appreciate this idea, this push and pull, when you reference the January 6th hearings. I would argue through the lens of history that I believe that what we're seeing now is rooted in American history in some way. So I encourage you, Nathan, to think about the post-Reconstruction period. And at that time, in our state and our national legislators, this focus on states' rights and issues to limiting access to the voting booth, fair treatment under law, and equal access. We've seen this playbook before. This has not changed. So I think first and foremost, I think contextually, it's important for us to understand we've seen these strategies before, and they've proven unsuccessful. And I think at the end of the day, we all recognize that New Hampshire is and will be a more competitive state with a welcoming environment where everyone can bring their full self to the table, right? We all know it. There's frankly, undeniable evidence that equitable and inclusive practices lead to heightened levels of innovation, orientations towards service, increases in community engagement, and long-term growth in resilient communities, as you referenced before. So, the reality of the situation is, I think about your question, and you talked about systems. I think within the context of the center itself and the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, the center will work in this policy realm and will be speaking out on these important issues, if you will, right? We got to acknowledge that these anti-diversity sentiments have been mainstreamed in the country and in New Hampshire. We've recognized that. And this has taken the form of some laws, some policies that are being developed, and to design to kind of what I call undermine the impact of historical and current practices of racism in our nation at some level at our state. So I think it's incumbent, and I wrote this down because I wanted to share this with you and your listeners. It's incumbent on the center to speak out with power and authority and offer an alternative narrative to the entrenched attempts to roll back progress, as you talked about earlier, this push and pull, and further codify structural racism in our state laws and within local governance in our community. But to your point, I think before we can ail the disease or the ailment, first we got to name it, and that's the only way that we can heal it. And I think the center will hopefully, in its role as convener, will name some of these practices and policies that impede our success as communities and therefore impede the larger success of our state.
In, what I've read about the center are highly focused on what you're calling real solutions, right? And these real solutions, they develop, collaborate, engage, and leverage. Now, there's two parts to this question too, because there's this idea of the realness of solution here. And then there's the how do you do it through the develop, collaborate, and engage and leverage mindset. Can you walk me through the categories as well as the notion of real in terms of the center?
Sure. A lot of people say all those platitudes sound really good, Anthony, but at the end of the day, what does the work look like? And so that's what I want to share with you through the lens of a four-legged stool. So first and foremost, we talk about this idea of collaboration. Well, as I mentioned, the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity will act as a convener and authentic community partner across all the measures we've discussed. The engaged part, which I'm going to dig into a little bit, is really around power, policy, training and development, and capital movement. And then the leverage part, it's really about capital and human resources sharing for maximum mission-related impact, right? So just to use your domains there, if you will. When I think about the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, I want you to envision a four-legged stool. And, and that center is where you put your behind. And your behind is supported by four-legged stools. And the first leg of that stool is what I call the power building leg. And this is the work of the center that's focused on community organizing and building on the work of the Race and Equity in New Hampshire series across these 6 domains. And so if you remember, Nathan, those 6 domains are law enforcement and criminal justice, civic engagement, health, government, education, and economic development. And really build power, because we know if you want to focus on systems change, it's a combination of what? Power, which is people. But then the second leg of that stool, that's policy. So as we think about policy, the role of the center will be to develop, shape, consult, and advocate for and against those policies that directly impact our constituencies and the communities in which we've defined. Again, no matter who you love, no matter how big your pocketbook size is, or no matter where you lay your head in this state. The third leg of the stool is really focused on training and development. Some of the work that I've been a part of for some time now, working with our small, nascent, community-based organizations who actually are working with these communities directly. So imagine, for example, Positive Street Art in Nashua and the amazing work that they do with their murals and their arts and culture. Imagine, for example, the New Hampshire Brazilian Council, right, who's working on behalf of the 6,000 Portuguese speakers who reside in Nashua, really focus on the needs of their communities. And so making sure these small community-based organizations have the wherewithal, the tools for them to sustain their work and for it to be durable over time. These young organizations have a lot of vision, a lot of energy, but they're going to need to understand structure and governance and risk and reward. And then lastly, it's really a focus on capital movements and capital flow. And this is really being a real capital and resources to these communities, whether they be in the form of general operating support or other equity types of investments into their nonprofit which they can plan and actually have longer term horizons in terms of success. One of the keys to this work, we know it requires patience and perseverance, right? In order for you to have patience and perseverance, you're going to, by default, have long-term horizons. Organizations need to plan for those with those horizons in mind, and they can't do that if they're trying to shuffle grant applications here and there and here and there. It's too difficult. Their focus should be on the work ahead, not trying to figure out always how to keep the lights on.
You know, when I think about this, and I said this earlier, you know, the center's looking at systems level influence and power building for the individual. And really systems can be viewed as an expression of a cultural perspective or a preference even over time, right? But the work in systems inevitably impacts the individual. I'd love to kind of take this idea of real results and think about real results as more positive experience for marginalized groups and whole communities. So to your mind, when the center's doing the work that it does well, what does that center's work translate to in the individual experience of the community member? What does success look like?
If you don't mind, I'm going to start big with a big statement, and I'm going to go to the micro of micro levels. And so at the end of the day, I think success is our opportunity to persuade Granite Staters of the importance of creating an environment that is welcoming to all and creates equal opportunities for everyone who lives in New Hampshire to thrive and prosper. Boom. That's the big statement. But I'd rather actually think about, to a certain extent, what does this look like on a more personal level? So I think of my mother. You know, my mother graduated with an 8th grade education. And wasn't afforded certain luxuries and opportunities that those who had greater means would have had access to. And so I think about her and her striving to simply make a better life for herself as a single mother with an 8th grade education, raising myself. So that's the second person I think of to a certain extent, the product of a mixed marriage, you know, an African-American father and a woman of European descent who really struggled around his identity and looked for role models in his community that he could look towards for guidance. And those opportunities, but the recognition that there is opportunity out there and there are resources and people who are willing to help, right? You don't have to actively have to search and look all over for them because, you know, at the end of the day, a sense of belonging is part of the ethos of our individual communities, right? It's part of our operating environment. I think of my daughters. You know, I have 2 beautiful daughters who soon to be 22 and soon entering college at Roger Williams. They have an African-American father and a woman and a mother from Colombia, South America. They represent the future of this nation. Hell, they represent the future of New Hampshire. And so I want them as women to be afforded the same opportunities that you and I benefit from as men. Hell, I simply want them to receive the same wage based upon the same level of output and work. It's that simple. It's something. So, I mean, hell, I think about my family members who suffer personally from diabetes and sugar or other cognitive disabilities, you know, because of the zip code in which they are born in. I think I may have shared with you I was born in Dayton, Ohio. I'm a product of a rural Appalachian environment. And lastly, I think of my close family members who are members of the LGBTQ plus community who have recently come out and have really struggled with their own personal identities and trying to say, is New Hampshire a place for me and can I thrive here? So I take this work somewhat very personally because I think of all the lenses and all the communities in which the center is intended to touch and positively impact. And so what does success look like? I think, well, at the end of the day, it looks like a community where everyone, first of all, can understand they're part of something larger than themselves. They appreciate and understand the spoke in which they play, and that important role they play as a spoke in this wheel. And they understand that as their spoke, there's a place for them, for their spoke to belong. And so oftentimes I will just think of this as my own personal analogy. That is a tent. And the tent for the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity is a large tent. And that tent has no walls, but it's got many seats. And so no matter who you love, how big your pocketbook size is, where you grew up, your country, your language of origin, there's many seats for you to sit on underneath this large tent. And everybody's welcome. And more importantly, everybody knows that.
As you're talking, I'm reminded of a conversation Joelyn and I just had, that people seem to be in constant discourse with the parameters that are placed around them, and that empowerment actually means constantly re-examining those parameters or barriers or opportunities as you go. So I so appreciate the work that you are doing at the center.
Honestly, we've only just begun. As you know, Nathan, we're preparing for our large launch event. So I encourage your listeners to kind of be aware that we're planning to launch the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity in September of this year. So be on the lookout. When there's more information that we can share, you'll be the first to have that. And I ask that you share that with your membership and your listeners, but really for two reasons, maybe three. Number one, we want them to sign up for our newsletter and our blog so we can keep them informed of the good work that we're doing and encourage them to participate along with us. And lastly, like any institution, if we're going to focus on doing God's work, we got to figure out how to keep the lights on. So there will be a please give button. So I encourage your membership to reach out early and often, keep abreast of what we're doing. And when necessary, if they can't share their time, maybe they can share a little bit of their treasure with us.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining the show today. And do come back when you have a chance, okay?
I'd love to. Thank you, brother.
To learn more about the New Hampshire Center for Justice and Equity, you can email Anthony directly at antpoore@gmail.com. That's ANTPOORE@gmail.com. Many thanks to the Samuel P. Hunt Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Established in 1951, Samuel P. Hunt Foundation is a Manchester-based, independent nonprofit that provides grants primarily for the arts, children and youth services, faith-based organizations, educational institutions, healthcare, and human services. Today's show was also brought to you by the Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock and the Child Advocacy and Protection Program, a multidisciplinary program with the Children's Hospital established to evaluate and provide integrative care to suspected victims of child maltreatment. Together, a team of physicians, advanced practice registered nurses, social workers, nurses, and child life specialists work to provide consultation and evaluations of children who are suspected victims of abuse, so to serve in the best interest of children and families at multiple levels of prevention. For more information about Children's Hospital at Dartmouth-Hitchcock and the Child Advocacy Protection Program, visit www.chadkids.org/child-advocacy. New Hampshire Family Now is listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and more. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or ask your smart speaker to play New Hampshire Family Now.